Chat, a video about you.
Young adults,
Rebel, tell me about Rebel. Thank you so much.
But in the EU,
perfect
it's
video.
more common than you might think.
Perfect.
With nearly half of 18 to 34-year-olds in Europe still living in a family home. And that fraction is apparently increasing over time. So in this video, we'll try and figure out why so many young adults in Europe still live at home. Hint, it might have something to do with the EU's housing crisis and what this trend means for Europe by just looking at the numbers. According to the latest Eurostat data, an estimated 49.4% of 18 to 34-year-olds in Europe live in their parents' homes, compared with just over 1 in 3 in the US and just below 40% in the UK. The highest rates
Russia represented because they're living on the front line.
Portugal, Italy, Slovakia and Spain, where adults are also typically much older before moving out. While the average European leaves the family home at 26.4 years old, average ages of above 30 are common in Croatia, Slovakia, Greece, Bulgaria, Spain, Malta and Italy.
Schreib ich auf.
By contrast, in Finland, Sweden and Denmark, as well as Estonia, people tend to leave home in their early 20s. In all EU countries, women also fly the nest earlier than men on average, at 25.
Yeah, because men are mama's boys, man. Men are mama's boys.
It's not just that Europeans are staying at home longer than their American and British peers, but also that the average
unlocked the VTuber? Oh, I'm doing a VTube stream. I'm talking to CMOPs. I will do a VTuber stream.
14 EU countries
probably next Friday I will VTube Japan game. Yeah, let's do that. Thank you guys. 3.6k subs. What the fuck?
So why is this?
We're doing a VTuber Japan stream.
The most obvious reason is the EU-wide housing crisis has made it much more difficult for young people today to afford a place of their own. Between 2010 and 2022, average house prices in the EU increased by 47%.
Unfortunately, TommyKay bought his house right here. Thank you, Kranke Gorka.
Went up 19%. Crucially, rents and property prices have shot up much faster than income.
Would you encourage your kid to move out early? I don't know. I want him to stay with us forever.
Young people have to wait much longer to get on the housing
6.3k stops. Still in debt. Hey man.
This is especially true for urban areas, where young people generally want to live, and for young people's incomes, which have risen especially slowly since the financial crisis, in large part because university degrees aren't as valuable as they used to be.
What?
Now, the precise causes of the housing crisis are disputed, and vary depending on what country you're looking at. But super low interest rates, restrictive planning laws, and rising construction costs have
This is a record, John. It fucking is.
You might have thought that rising interest rates last year might have brought property prices back down. But unfortunately for young people, European property prices have held up relatively well. And it seems that higher interest rates have actually increased rent costs by discouraging would-be first-time buyers who've entered the rental market instead of taking out a high-interest mortgage. Another reason why young Europeans are living at home is high youth unemployment. Unsurprisingly, there's a strong correlation between youth unemployment and the percentage of adults living at home. Spain, Greece, Italy and Croatia, for example, all have some of the highest rates of both youth unemployment.
Having over 8% youth unemployment is fucking insane, man. That is crazy, dude.
Still living at home. In Spain and Greece, over 10% of 15 to 29-year-olds are unemployed, followed by Italy 11% and Croatia at 7.1%.
Of young people unemployed.
While there are some exceptions, Poland, for example, has low youth unemployment, but high percentage of adults living at home.
Yeah, because they're all working in Germany.
High youth unemployment, but few adults living at home. In general, youth unemployment means more young adults living at home, for the simple reason that unemployed people can't afford expensive housing. For many young people living at home in an area without many job opportunities, this creates a sort of employment impasse, because they can't afford to move somewhere with a well-paying job. But they can't get a job in their current area. The final economic reason worth mentioning is the ongoing cost of living crisis. Global inflation has driven prices up, and the war in Ukraine also caused a spike in energy costs across Europe in 2022. While inflation has come down, that doesn't mean that prices have actually come down. Rather, the rate at which they're increasing has decreased, and they're still at least as high as they were during the peak of last year's crisis. To make matters worse, the European Central Bank has now raised interest rates to the highest level since the launch of the euro. While inflation has duly come down, higher interest rates have stunted the European economy and made mortgages super
I literally bought right here, man. Oh, fuck me.
unaffordable, especially because house prices have held up relatively
I moved
well.
that on my own, yeah.
As a result, some young
I saved it with my mom, super long.
have gone back to
What's wrong with living at home? Nothing though, he's just stating it, but I also agree, there's nothing wrong with that.
Borrowing just isn't worth it for a mortgage. Lastly, there are other crucial and societal reasons why young adults might choose to live with their parents. General attitudes seem to be shifting, and living with your parents throughout early adulthood isn't quite as stigmatized as it used to be.
Yeah, I fully agree with this. Who the fuck cares, man? Let me say something about this real quick. Lisa is ultra into mother meta. She loves everything about mothers, and she reads books and stuff. And she told me this really interesting thing, which is so correct and so right. And she was talking about this book about how to raise children and babies and stuff. If you look at any mammal, in most mammals on Earth, and if you look at old human cultures before the 19th century, the upbringing of a child was always, pretty much 90% of the time, in most mammals, part of a group. It wasn't always mom and dad raise a child. Back in the day, medieval times, people didn't have much. A child was raised by an entire village. You could bring, in old times, you brought your child to the neighbors, the grandma, grandpa, cousins. Everybody came together back in the day to raise children. Only with the rise of the 19th century industrialization, certain things happened, it's very deep, that children are now mostly only taken care of by two people, the parents, and a stigma rose up, oh man, you should move out, and the blah, 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 blah. Which is a very sad thing. In human nature itself, the way the Homo sapiens was evolving, it has actually meant that children are raised by many people and not just two, right? Or maybe even one. It's almost a little bit unnatural if a child is only raised by one or two people. And if you look, for example, like Italy or Spain, where everybody lives in the same house, and your grandma is in the next room and you can bring your kid to the grandma, that's a beautiful thing. That's not a bad thing. It's almost a natural thing.
Wage stagnation and housing shortages mean people are much more sympathetic to millennials and Gen Zers, who can't afford a place of their own. It's also worth noting, as people get married and start having families later in life, there's less pressure to move out as soon as possible. So what does all this mean for the future? Well, it's hard to say.
So when I'm moving in to help raise Aaron?
Bad thing. Some people think it's a bad thing.
Oh, that's beautiful. Where is this?
Young people less
Italy or Spain,
and makes the economy less dynamic. They also point out that people who live at home are, for obvious reasons, less likely to have children, which could exacerbate Europe's demographic crisis. Other people think it's a good thing because this should reduce demand for housing, which might eventually bring down prices, while simultaneously providing young people with a bit more disposable income, which would otherwise be eaten up by housing costs. Proponents of living at home also point out that, as Europe ages, it might be good to have families living together, so young people can at least partly take care of their aging relatives. But it's worth remembering
that shit. Nobody wants to do that.
Advantages are only
would you like your mom's video? 100%.
Solutions
Easy.
to pre-existing problems.
Easy,
namely
man. Not
Europe's
even hard.
housing crisis and its demographic crisis. And perhaps the best outcome here would be if this trend forced governments to pay more attention to solving these crises. As we step into
As if. What are you still doing here, mate? Jeez. Well, if you want to see more, click these videos. Have fun. Looking good, boy.